Hi, welcome to this patrons event. We are extremely grateful to all of you for your support for The Guardian, and I hope you enjoy what is a very special event tonight to mark 200 years of The Guardian's existence. I'm Anushka Asthana, and before I start, we do really want to hear from you tonight too. I've got some questions already that have been sent in, but you can continue to send them to us live using the Q&A box on the left of the screen. If you start sending them now, we'll get through as many as possible later. Your questions will be visible to the audience, and if you want us to mention your name, then remember to include it. Now, let me introduce our speakers. We have Katharine Viner, who has been Editor-in-chief of The Guardian since 2015. That means she's overseen a lot of things: the Panama and Paradise Papers, the amazing reporting revealing the Windrush scandal, Cambridge Analytica revelations, and then if that wasn't enough, Brexit, Trump, and COVID. Welcome, Katharine. And Alan Rusbridger, who was editor before that from 1995, editing through the 9/11 terror attacks, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, and along the way, many exclusive investigations, including Edward Snowden and the NSA files. Welcome to you both. Now, I'm going to start by asking you both a few questions, and then I will open it up to the audience in about half an hour or so. Can I start with you, Katharine, and ask, what did it feel like when you first became editor of The Guardian?
Gosh, yeah, it was a very intense and emotional day. Obviously, I was very excited and very proud. But I remember the thing that I was thinking about the most was this point that I was the first woman editor-in-chief, and just how exciting and profound that was. I thought about all the other Guardian women that had been over the years. Alan's former deputy, Georgina Henry, who died. There were these fantastic women over the years: Mary Stott, who invented the women's page; Emily Hobhouse, who exposed the concentration camps and the Boer War, the British concentration camps. And I sort of thought about all of these Guardian women, and I thought, how lucky I was to be in an era where it was possible for there to be a woman editor, and I felt like I was, I wouldn't have been here without all of them. So it was mainly just an incredibly exciting day.
Did you get lots of support from other senior women in different industries who saw that as quite a groundbreaking moment as well?
Yeah. I mean, yes. Yeah, it was really moving. Yeah, it was great. And now, of course, there's loads of women editors of newspapers. So, yeah, it's a trend.
Good to set that trend. Alan, that was the end of your tenure as editor-in-chief. How different did it feel when you first took over in 95?
Well, I think I knew in 1995 that my editorship would be defined by the digital age. I'd been to America a couple of years previously and seen the internet. We didn't have the internet in the office in those days, and it was pretty obvious that the days of numbers of print would be numbered in some way. Could be 5 years, could be 50 years, but I had to somehow prepare The Guardian for a completely different kind of existence. And I didn't know anything about computers. I mean, I had one. I liked them, but I had no idea really where to begin, and there were no examples anywhere else in the world. When we went to see the New York Times in 1994, they had decided that news didn't work on the internet. They were designing the New York Times as a culture site. So, I mean, that was terrifying.
Why did they say that?
But it was exciting. They had given away the entire archive. It's amazing now. They thought it had no value, and so there were about 3 people in an office doing a kind of what's on this week in New York. They thought that news would never work. So that's how none of us knew anything, and it was kind of frightening, and it was kind of wonderfully exciting because we could make it up as we went along, and we did.
I mean, you must look back and know that there were things you got absolutely right about that. You were certainly right that we were moving to more of a web model. Do you look back and think there were things that you were just totally wrong about at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably if we got half of it right, we were doing quite well. And of course, in terms of so-called leading an organization, there was no way that you could stand up in front of the class and say, follow me, everything's going to be all right, because quite often within weeks or months it would turn out you were completely wrong, and if you were to have any credibility at all, you had to find a way of leading the organization that made everybody really internalize the problems that were buzzing around in your own head. So it had to be a journey that everybody went on.
And Katharine, in the years since you've taken over, that journey has continued, hasn't it? And not just about going from print to a website, but also thinking about storytelling across so many different mediums. Obviously, I'm biased, but I hope I'm right to say that you see the podcast, for example, as important a platform to The Guardian as any of your other outputs, like video or however we want to tell these stories. Do you think of The Guardian now as a completely different type of news organisation than it once was?
Yeah, I think the way we think about it is that there's just lots of great journalism in all sorts of different platforms, and we just need to make sure that all of it is really good. And if so there will be the newspaper, which is really good, and Guardian Weekly, which is really good. There is the daily podcast, Today in Focus, hosted by you, Anushka, which is why you're dropping it in, which is really fantastic, and a whole host of other podcasts as well. Loads of video, and including an Oscar-winning documentary, which I was hoping to be able to drop in today. Hope our parents have all seen that, Colette, which won the the Oscar for the best documentary short. And everything we put out on the website, everything we put out on the app, all of it should feel like The Guardian. Just all of it in different platforms, but it should all still feel completely like us. Otherwise, it's not working, I don't think.
And so much of it is about stories, isn't it? And so, can I ask you first, Katharine, about the impactful stories that you're working on all the time? Which ones have really stood out for you?
I think of the scoops that I love scoops. I mean, that's what we're in it for, and that's it's very exciting on those moments. And I think, obviously the Dominic Cummings breaking lockdown last year was a very memorable day. But probably, I think it might take a while for me to shift, this being the series, the series of scoops that I'm most excited about, which was the Windrush scandal. I think you mentioned that at the top, which, when we first did a story, we did it as a feature, and it was an interview with Paulette Wilson, who been in this country since she was a child. She'd worked here all her life. She'd even worked in the House of Commons canteen. And then she was threatened for deportation to Jamaica, a place she'd not been to since she was a small child, and thrown into Yarlswood Detention Centre. And we just couldn't really believe it. And I remember it was Amelia Gentleman who did the investigations, and we were saying, gosh, this is an amazing story. What a terrible thing to happen to this woman. And then the phone started ringing, and you started to realise there were 2 or 3 more. And there's now up to 4,000 victims of this. And I think, without Millie's reporting, without her pulling the threads together, we wouldn't have had such an impact, and obviously caused a huge impact, brought down the Home Secretary at the time, Amber Rudd, made the government a bit wobbly for a time. And I think, well, I hope, and maybe this is more of a vain hope, but that it has shifted the debate a bit on immigration. Although this week we've been reporting on what happens to EU citizens under the so-called hostile environment, and it's pretty serious as well. So, but yeah, I think that would probably be the story that's been most exciting since I've been editor.
I'm going to ask you about the same thing, Alan, but just quickly, Katharine, I wonder if you realised when that Dominic Cummings story dropped how big it was going to be.
No. It was, we'd been working on it for a while. We hadn't quite been able to get everything we needed to get it over the line. The Cummings, their approach to the press was just to ignore you, which is actually quite hard if you're trying to go with a story, if they don't deny it or confirm it, if they just ignore you. So anyway, we got this missing piece from the Mirror, and that's why we did a joint scoop with the Mirror. And I remember going home on a Friday night thinking, well, I think it's a pretty good story, but I don't know how big it's going to go. And it was already pretty big on Friday night. But when it went massive, it was on Saturday when the Cabinet came out one by one and said things like, I think Michael Gove said something like, "Is it really a crime to care for your wife and child?" And I was so furious. I remember threw my phone onto the sofa. I was so angry. And it was, I think what made it took it from being a big story to being a really massive story was the way the cabinet responded, the absolute contempt for people's feelings. If Boris Johnson had said, "This is a disgrace, Cummings shouldn't have done that, no one should do that," I think they could have moved on from it. But it became a gigantic story because of their response to it, which actually is often the case, Alan, isn't it? I mean, it's often the case that it's the response that seals the deal.
Certainly
What do you
is.
think, Alan? And did you miss the job a bit when you were watching stories like that unfold?
No, I felt very relieved not to be doing it, because as Kath knows, it's very stressful. I mean, it's interesting. The two great investigative reporters I work with, David Lee and Nick Davis, they now talk about the stress of it. That feeling, wake up in the middle of the night. I'm sure Kath has this, and you just think there's some. That paragraph, did that paragraph get in? Was that, did we make an editing mistake? Is there something that we haven't thought about? And not to have those sort of midnight sweats is quite a nice feeling, I can assure you.
Someone said to me the other day, if you don't feel a bit sick when you go to bed, the story wasn't good enough. Alan, what about you? What impactful story stands out for you? And also within that, are there times where it's got a bit hairy, where you think, gosh, this story could have a huge kind of impact on me as well?
Well, I suppose the Snowden story had the biggest impact. I remember being in the New York office, waiting for Edward Snowden to reveal himself. Usually with these stories, the whistleblower goes to ground and there's a hunt to find out who it was. Snowden was the reverse. He had decided at the end of the first week that he was going to unmask himself. And I knew that was going to be a completely global story. And you sit there, the story goes up on your website at whatever it was, 5 p.m., and then you just watch. It's like a sort of detonation of a bomb. And for the next 2 weeks in New York, every single TV screen, probably every single TV screen around the world, was covering this story. But it had great jeopardy, because the British police, I think, investigated me for about 4 or 5 years, and everything about the story was so fraught with legal, moral, ethical, technological, governmental implications, that it had to be handled so delicately, at the same time as having this enormous, I think, importance and global impact.
And when you say you were being investigated for 4 years, what was that like? How did that feel? And I also want to know how it felt when you were standing in the basement watching the files get destroyed.
Well, the police never came to see me. I mean, I knew they were there, and I think there are very few moments in editing life where you think, actually, I might get arrested for this. It would be claimed that this was a offence probably against the Espionage Act in America, as well as the Official Secrets Act in this country. And the striking thing about both those laws is that there's no defence. You can't say this is why I did it, or this is why I consider this important, the story important. There is no defence, and so that was always there in the back of my mind. But then you think, well, if this story is as important as I think it is, then that's a risk you just have to take. I mean, on the destruction of the machines, that was a result of Jeremy Hayward, who was then the cabinet secretary, coming to see me and saying, "You've done enough." And it was sort of odd situation where you have to explain to the cabinet secretary that it's not for him to tell a newspaper when we've done enough. That was a sort of separation of powers that we took place, in the 18th century, with the press being the fourth estate and being a separate estate from government. And he listened to me and he went away and then came back the following week and said, well, you've definitely done enough now, and if you don't stop now, we'll stop you. And I said to him, well, we've already got the material in New York, because I knew that this moment would come. And in New York, of course, there's no way that an American government would try and injunct the New York Times or the Washington. They can't do it because of the Pentagon Papers case in the 1970s. So the material was safely stowed, and I told him that we would go on reporting. But he clearly wanted something that he could go back to Whitehall and say, look, I've got something. And the something he wanted was for us to destroy our computers. So we said, well, actually, if anybody's going to destroy our computers, we'll do it. Thank you very much. So these two gnomes from GCHQ came along and pointed to the bits that we had to smash up, and it was an interesting, to people who thought you could destroy a computer with a sledgehammer and a bit of super glue. No, you have to use angle grinders and drills, and they did a very, very thorough job, which we filmed, and then they were a bit surprised when we then put it up on the website a couple of weeks later.
Always a nice theatre of it, Alan. Eh?
Yeah, right. So that became, another bit of the story.
Katharine, just on that, I mean, there are so many highs and lows of being the editor-in-chief of The Guardian. And I was really thinking about this, about you very recently. You mentioned the amazing Oscar that was won for Colette, which is really amazing. On the same day that you found out about that, we actually lost a colleague in India to COVID. And I just wondered how much of a roller coaster the role feels like, how many highs and lows there are.
I mean, it is just constant, I have to say. I mean, what Alan described as the sort of, the middle of the night sweats and so on. I mean, it's that all the time, is some version of that all the time. You'll just think, oh, when it's fatal is when you think, oh, this is rather a quiet day. Or it's a Friday afternoon, you think, oh, maybe I'll be able to leave at sort of 4 or 5 today. No. Something will always happen. I mean, there's always drama. I think there's always this social media memes that, there's always someone posting something that, causes problems for you, or, there's a lot of drama around journalism beyond the journalism itself. So, yes, we lost a colleague, Karkley, who's been a news assistant for The Guardian for 10 years. She died of COVID. She was only in her early 50s. We got through the crisis until then without losing any colleagues. So it was a pretty awful day.
Katharine just mentioned social media. I don't know by 2015 how much of a thing it was and how difficult it was, but do you look at that, Alan, and think it's totally changed how we work as journalists and the debate around what we talk about and write about?
I think a lot. I mean, when I did my book Breaking News, I sort of did a timeline for myself, because things happen so quickly, sometimes you have to stand back. And it was only in 2006 that Facebook started, and Kath will remember this. We none of us thought that Facebook had anything to do with news. That was where our kids were sort of posting embarrassing pictures of them. Mm-hmm.
You made us all get an account there.
Well, I did, because partly because my kids were on it, and Twitter at the same month, and then, and of course by 2015, it wasn't anything like it is now, but we had some inkling of both the highs and the lows. I think there are. You have to keep reminding yourself there are great things about 4 billion people being able to communicate who never had a voice. It's chaotic. It can be horrible and ugly and hate-filled, but there are wonderful things there too. But I'm sure it's made Kath's life infinitely more complicated than it was for me.
Yeah, I can imagine that it has.
I don't see her disagreeing with that.
I mean, social media, it used to be such a fun thing. And it's just become much more vicious and politicized, I think. I still think, I do think there are places where you can have fun on it, but probably not very much as a Guardian journalist.
It's hard.
Well, as you will discover one day, Kath, I hope, because actually when you're the sort of figurehead for the organization, anybody who wants to be nasty about the Guardian will come and be nasty to you, and they used to do that to me. And now I'm a civilian. I find it a much less nasty place. I mean, occasionally it takes off, but people don't see me as the sort of, the way of kicking the Guardian, which I'm sure poor Kath has to put up with a lot.
There was a limit to that once when I thought I couldn't be kicked for anything anymore. So obviously for all the political stuff, Israel, Palestine, everything, you'll be kicked, obviously. But there was one where someone came on absolutely furious about a recipe for a Portuguese custard tart, that it was a sort of disgrace. And who did I think I was to run this Portuguese? And I just thought, that's it. Because I think sort of people do assume you've made every single decision. It's Portuguese custard tart,
Yeah.
And obviously that was one decision I haven't made.
So as well as getting more hate on social media in recent years, for many reasons, culture wars perhaps, it feels like The Guardian has attracted a lot of people, particularly post-Brexit, post-Trump. It feels like a place where we kind of represent people's values in many ways. And then, of course, you saw all of that through, Katharine, and then you saw COVID hit earlier this year. And earlier last year. Gosh, I've forgotten. I just want to ask you what that was like to oversee that story and how worrying it was for The Guardian as an organisation.
So I think the story has been, absolutely fascinating. And lots of things that I think are really important to The Guardian, like strong reporting on science and health, based in facts. And good science, that's really human stories, the political implications of big decisions, sort of libertarianism versus decisions, but what is the public interest in all these matters. I mean, lots of these areas are really strong areas for The Guardian and really important. So I think we really stepped up on all those fronts. I mean, and then particularly, I think the holding the powerful to account. I felt at the beginning, it did change, but at the beginning, I felt like the rest of the media was doing a lot of, just cheerleading, really, and sort of saying, with almost sort of warlike, we have to accept what the government says. And I think right from the beginning, we were sort of calling out democracy and people, cabinet ministers and special advisors breaking lockdown and so on. But in terms of what it was like in the, for the journalists, the hardest thing was, so digital publishing you can do from anywhere. I could do it from my phone anywhere, it's easy. But print publishing, we need a small team in the office for a number of reasons. And at the very beginning, I think it's quite hard to forget because you move on so quickly, don't you, and move into the new rules and so on. But at the beginning, it really was quite scary and nobody was going out. Do you remember that you could go out for 1 hour of exercise a day and people really were sticking to that. And so we had to get a number of volunteers in the office to get the paper out. And they, people were scared and, it had to be done on a voluntary basis. And, we're very grateful to those people. I obviously came in too, because I think if you're asking people to come in under those circumstances, you should be there too. And it was challenging. I mean, I wouldn't say it's necessary. I think it's challenging been challenging in lots of businesses. It's nothing like being a healthcare worker, for example. But there were a couple of days when we were so low on staff that I did think, maybe we won't be able to get the paper out. And that's only happened once before in a dispute in the 80s. Alan, is that right? And I didn't want it to happen again. I mean, and it didn't happen. But it's been tough. I mean, ever since then, most journalists. I'm in the office today in the Guardian building, but there's only about 30 of us here. So there's hundreds of journalists that are working remotely. The Guardian America team has not been in the office at all. Nobody's been in the office for 14 months. The Guardian Australia team are back in the office, all of them. So we're very jealous of them.
What have you made of it, watching it from outside the Guardian, Alan?
Well, hearing, I think the Guardian's had a terrific COVID, and hearing Kath describe it in that way is so much a part of what the Guardian is. I've just written a piece it's in the current New York Review of Books about this extraordinary 200-year span that the Guardian's just been celebrating. And often the most difficult thing a paper can do is the thing that Kath just described. So, COVID is not a war, but I think there was the thing that Kath was describing, a sort of feeling that you have to get in behind the government. This is a moment you have to forget your differences and not snipe from the sidelines. And if you think of the two things that I described in that piece were, one Kath touched on already, the Guardian's behaviour during the Boer War, where Scott was vehement in his opposition to Britain's behaviour. He exposed war crimes. He exposed the concentration camps. He had to have a police guard to work, and so did the workers on the paper at the time, because the Guardian was so reviled. But of course, 120 years later, that was completely right. And then Alistair Hetherington as editor, his first day in the office as editor, he wrote the famous leader about Suez. And again, most British papers thought, well, this is a moment we have to get him behind the government. And of course, now these seem like easy choices. And the Guardian stance on Suez was undoubtedly the right choice. But I can understand, Kath feeling the sort of the tug to get in line and not to do the kind of challenging reporting that the Guardian did.
Did it feel like that with Iraq?
Yeah, I think whenever you have a war, that there is that tension, and before the First World War, Scott was right to the last day before the First World War. He was trying to engineer peace. And in that war, of course, once the shooting started, the Guardian did fall in behind it. But if you feel there's an unjust war, then it's a different matter, and it takes some obstinacy and courage is an overused word, but you do have to, if you believe something's wrong, you have to stand aside from it.
Thank you. I'm going to start bringing in a few audience questions. I've got a few more of my own as well, which I'll mix in there. But Katharine, I wanted to ask you this question from Claude Green. Has the Guardian ever thought of running campaigns? And then in bracket, dare one say it, Daily Mail style?
I think everyone, every editor would have a different approach to this. I feel right now that the best thing to do is do a campaign through lots and lots of reporting. So not necessarily saying we demand this outcome, but reporting something very, very heavily. I mean, that's the way I sort of, we might change on this, but I think that's the way I've been thinking about our climate reporting. So we've really increased the size of the team. We've got big teams in America and Australia as well. Australia is obviously a big flashpoint for the climate. We change the language, so we don't say climate change, we say the climate crisis and so on. We've done a couple of climate pledges to our readers. We've pledged to cut our emissions to net zero and so on. So it's to try and sort of, and then I think loads of series, a big series on polluters, who are the biggest polluting companies in the world, and try and sort of really push stories in a direction, push issues in a direction that way. But for me, sort of actually coming out and out campaigning, I'm not sure it feels right. But as I say, I think we can do it through heavy reporting, a lot of it.
And how does that kind of work together with, and I'll put this to you, Alan, the kind of different parts of the paper, if you like? I spent a short time at the Washington Post once, and I was quite taken by the fact that they obviously had different editors for comment and for news. And yeah, in the UK, not only will you oversee comment and news in The Guardian, you'll also write leaders. So on the one hand, it is all about reporting. On the other hand, you're quite open about what you think. How do you feel about that dynamic?
Well, I've changed my mind a bit on this, and Kath, you might have to close your ears at this point. I think generally it's desirable to separate the two, because I think the act of going after stories and reporting is a completely different activity from having big thoughts and trying to persuade minds. And towards the end of my time as editor, I put Jonathan Friedland really in charge of the whole comment area, as a way of achieving some kind of separation. And I think that's better now. I mean, I used to deride it slightly. I remember when Len Downey was editor of the Washington Post, he never voted. And I asked him why not. And he said, well, I don't want to think that I have any opinions on anything, because if I did that, that would cloud my approach to news reporting. And I thought that was, over puritanical and silly. But I I actually think there's actually something rather admirable about it. But it might not work in a British context, because the British press is very different from the American press. Although actually one of the things I really liked about what Kath did when she went to Australia, and there was an election, how many years after you turned up? About a year or two after you turned up, and everyone was waiting to see who the Guardian would endorse. And Kath said, well, we're not going to endorse anyone, because that's not really what we're here for. And I think that was tremendously popular with Australian readers. They felt a sort of sigh of relief, because they'd had so many sort of Murdochs and other sort of big cheese proprietors telling them what to vote as though that was the most important thing. And I thought that was tremendously refreshing of Cass to say, well, we're not going to do that. And I thought the readers really responded to that.
No, they did really love it. And I wonder if the clue is in what you said there, the sort of Australian context. Because I think here, because there's so few progressive voices, I think there's so much pressure on us to be, I mean, it's part of the reason we get our loved and hated, is that there's so much pressure on us to be the progressive voice that, I mean, because when I started, I did sort of say, why do we have leaders? What do we, and that's all hell broke loose, because people saying, how else do you know what we stand for? But I think it's something that's worth coming back to all the time. I mean, I think part of what I don't think a newspaper like The Guardian is there just to say, give the facts. I think we're there to give something else as well, which the New York Times and the Washington Post do too. But as discussed, they're just managed by two separate people. I mean, but I think, if we're saying we're about clarity and imagination, so we're about facts and we're about ideas. I sort of think it's probably better to have it all under one roof, but I'm absolutely open to how things change, because I think these are exactly the sort of things that are changing all the time with the digital revolution, with social media and so on. And so we must always be very alert to what those changes mean, I think.
Let me ask you a question that's sort of related to that, Katharine, that's come in from Paul White. Although before I do, I just thought I'd mention Leonard Downey from the Washington Post, who talked about not voting. When I was there, said he hadn't voted since 1984. And off the back of that, I decided not to vote in the next UK election as I was reporting on it. I was actually reporting on the Conservative campaign very, very close up for Sky News at the time. And I'm absolutely not purist about it, but I do think it made me think differently about the race. And I do think not having, especially when you're so close to reporting on something, not having that there in your mind, who am I going to vote for, can sometimes be quite refreshing and help, as I thought it did when we went to cover the Scottish independence referendum as well. So this is from Paul. Yeah, so this is from Paul White, which is sort of like, having watched Official Secrets, I'm interested to understand whether investigative journalism often changes the editorial position of the paper, as represented in the film, or does it normally result from the paper having a position which is being confirmed? Which I guess is in part asking, Katharine, do you find that the investigations that you oversee really push the direction of the paper in a particular way?
Yeah, the reporting always comes first. I think, if you sort of say, this is our leader line, go and find some stories on it, you just won't find any stories that way. You have to start with the story and then see where it leads. But obviously, those things that you uncover can push you in certain directions.
Okay, and this one, I think, to you, Alan, which reminds me of Jonathan Aitken somewhat. It's from John Clark. He says, holding powerful people and corporations to account can be dangerous, especially when they are litigious. Have there been occasions where The Guardian has faced existential threats as a result?
Well, I don't know about. I mean, if we'd lost against Jonathan Aitken, it would have cost us a lot of money. I mean, 2 or 3 million, and my career might not have survive because it was a very, very high profile libel action, and there was a kind of sort of lip smacking relish when people thought the Guardian was going to go down to Aitken, who fought a very high profile campaign. Am I allowed to just remember the extraordinary thing that led to Aitken's downfall? Because it was the most dramatic thing where we weren't doing great in the trial. Aitken was very charming in the box, and he had Mr. Justice Popplewell, and they bonded over their love of cricket, and there was no jury, and our solicitor Geraldine said, "Could we just find out? Can we go to the hotel where Mrs. Aitken was staying near Geneva?" And it seemed such a sort of fruitless mission. How on earth could a reporter bluff his way into the hotel and get her bill? That was what we wanted. And through the most astonishing stroke of luck, when Owen Bocott got to the hotel had gone into receivership, and there was just a security guard on the door who said, "Sure, go into the basement." And that got the clinching piece of evidence. And to be in court, as we had George Carman, our QC, who loved pulling rabbits out of hats at a late stage, and he passed this bit of paper up to Mr. Justice Popplewell, who immediately saw the significance of it and passed it down to Jonathan Aitken. And watching somebody's face as they realize that their life has been destroyed, and that everything in future is going to be different. He's probably going to go to jail. He got divorced later that night.
Wow.
Was just extraordinary. So and talk about courtroom drama. On that moment hung either the £3 million bill that we would have got, or Aitken ending up in jail. So there are moments of high drama in this job.
That's one of my favourite stories is Owen Bocott scrabbling around in the basement. This eureka moment of coming up with a bill that proved he'd lied. I mean, it is theatrical, filmic.
I can't imagine it. Amazing. Thank you for all your questions, by the way. If you've got them, don't forget to use the Q&A function. I will get through as many as I can. Catherine, William Parker asks, how has The Guardian's global reach changed during your tenure as editor?
I mean, we are just so huge, William. We have readers and we have contributors in every country in the world. Obviously, we started Guardian Australia and Guardian America some time ago. They're all now really thriving. We're actually really competing in Australia to be a sort of local news source. We've taken over quite a lot of the big local players like The Age and so on. And then, our latest push has been in Europe. So in the last 2 years, we've been doing a push on Europe. Our European readers really loved our Brexit coverage, found it very much more trustworthy than anything they could find elsewhere. And we really, we're really been embracing that audience and seeing what we can do with them. So yeah, it's more than 70% of the Guardian's audience is outside of the UK. And similar figures for the New York Times and the Washington Post with their home territories are less than 25%. So it's a really distinctive thing. We are a truly global voice in a way I think no other newspaper organisation is. Perhaps the Daily Mail could call itself one, but nobody else.
On those figures, I remember thinking when we had Brexit and the day after, the figures were just completely wild. And then for Trump, they were just even more wild. And then we always said, didn't we, that Trump was unbeatable. And then COVID happened and the numbers beat that day by day by day. Alan, by all means, comment on the kind of global reach, but also I like this question. We thought this was one for you. The Manchester Guardian, number one, had no headlines. Their introduction was the first step to distortion of content. Discuss. We need them, don't we, to blame the headlines when we get moaned at. I say, yeah, I don't write the
headlines. It's a very dense artifact. I mean, they only had 4 pages and they crammed in everything they could, so there was no room for headlines. I mean, I think this plays into this debate about whether there is such a thing as objectivity or not. And you both of you know, because you both worked in America, that Americans tend to believe in objectivity. Brits tend to believe that objectivity doesn't exist. And almost the moment you write a headline on top of a piece, I guess this is what the question's driving at, you may introduce an element of distortion in the sense that you're highlighting one element of the piece over another bit. You're trying to summarize it. All the people who say that a tweet is a very crude thing because it's only whatever it was, 130 now 240 characters. Trying to get a complicated thing into, that's what headline writing is, and it's a great skill, and sometimes it is a bit distorting just because it's having to make some kind of selection. I remember, I don't know if this is still going, Kath, maybe you're not aware of it, but the techies at one point, they were so thrilled by the sort of layout of the original Guardian. They created a little a sort of bot that each night turned the Guardian into the format of the Guardian in 1821. It's probably still being published somewhere, and none of us knows about it. And it's kind of gripping, actually, because you start at the top left column and you work your way through all the print, and you've got no headlines and no pictures and nothing to distract you. And it's quite an efficient way of reading. But anyway.
Thank you. So this is a question to both of you. What are your respective favourite front pages of the print edition? Who wants to go first?
I'll go for, well, Kath, thinking about that. I mean, there was a tremendous, we did all these big libel actions, and the headline people, older readers may remember, on Neil Hamilton was "A liar and a cheat." And with Aitken it was "He lied and lied and lied." And there's something tremendously satisfying about writing a headline like that, where you long to write that for months or years, and you can just, at last, you're free to write it. So in verbal terms, those were the most satisfying front pages. Probably 9/11 in terms of just, the gobsmacking greatest news picture of all time, probably, and just working how to do that with enough drama was visually, that was probably the most exciting page.
Katharine?
Yeah, I mean, I quite like those moments, the ones that mark moments that we're happy about, and obviously that doesn't happen very often. But Trump losing was quite a good front page. We did some really strong Brexit front pages as well, again using sort of visual devices. I think probably that we did one on Grenfell Tower sometime afterwards, where we profiled everybody who'd been killed in the tower. And we did a front page that had all their names forming the tower, and that was a really beautiful front page as well. In the before all of these terrible things happened, I'm trying to look at the date on this, but we did a beautiful front page when David Bowie died, which was just his face. It was a beautiful black and white picture. It won lots of awards, but that looks like an artifact from another era, really. But yeah.
Thank you. I like this one. I don't know who put this in. I don't have a name, but who do you think will provide better opposition to this government? The Labour Party or the Guardian? Why don't you take that one first, Alan? Or the Guardian?
Or the Guardian.
Or the Labour Party?
Well, it definitely shouldn't be the Guardian. I think that comes back to what we were talking about earlier. When I think the reason that the Washington Post and the New York Times came through in such strong, in a such a strong manner, is they didn't try and declare war on Trump. I think Marty Baron said early on, "We're at work, we're not at war," and I think Trump would have loved that if he could have. I mean, he did his best to portray these two great newspapers as the sort of liberal. Metropolitan out-of-touch elite, and actually the most powerful thing was just reporting. That's what Kath talked about earlier. And if you just stick to the facts, and Trump was constantly trying to bait the New York Times, and they were at their strongest when they just stuck to the facts. So I don't think it's the Guardian and I'm sure Kath would agree with this, it's not the Guardian's job to be in opposition. You should certainly report fairly, toughly, extremely questioningly, sometimes aggressively, what the government is doing. But what will count most is the reporting, not being in opposition, and that would, to my mind, be fatal.
But Katharine, isn't there some truth in the idea that, as you were saying at the beginning of the COVID outbreak, for example, it was newspapers like The Guardian holding politicians, holding the government to account, and at that stage, certainly not the Labour Party, because they decided not to.
But that's reporting, isn't it? I mean, that's what reporting is about. And I think, our job is to hold the powerful accountable. So that means the government, but it also means the Labour Party. And we'll do the same. And I think it's always worth remembering, I always say this, that The Guardian isn't tied to the Labour Party. We're not tied to any political party or any individual. We are quite interested in progressive ideas and principles and so on. But it's really important. I think you get into real trouble if you tie yourself too closely to a particular party or individual.
That's interesting. So someone's asked, intrigued that there was a conversation bringing Manchester back into the title. Why and why not?
I mean, there's never actually been a conversation. This is how stories happen, isn't it? This is how things happen. Somebody asked me about this at an event in Manchester last week, and perhaps it made its way into the Manchester press. We haven't considered. Somebody said, was it a mistake to lose it? And I said I didn't think it was a mistake, considering what people knew at the time. I think they were the paper wasn't classed as a national title. It was always classed as a regional title, which meant they couldn't access lots of things, including circulation figures and so on. So it made sense at the time. But what I said last week was that if we had kept the name in the title, I think it would have been fine. The New York Times, no one thinks it's just about New York. No one thinks the Washington Post is just about Washington. Although you could argue, I think, that the fact that there is no place name in our title does give us some freedom, and perhaps that could be one of the many reasons, perhaps a smaller reason, but that we do have such a global impact.
Thank you. Can I ask you both about this one? Someone's asking whether you could talk about how journalists come to write for The Guardian. They say the journalists are the heart of The Guardian and Observer. So I've often wondered how you find them and how you support them. Do you want to take that first, Alan?
Yeah, it's very funny reading the history of The Guardian, because I think until about 1960, it was almost a given that Oxford would be the recruiting ground. I mean, certainly Scott would, I think, would never have considered hiring anybody who didn't go to Oxford. It was really his idea of diversity was taking someone from Exeter College rather than Corpus. It was it was a broad ship, and I think that went on. Really, I mean, I think Cambridge was allowed in at some point during the 1920s, but and then of course that changed, and but there were routes in through, the way I came to The Guardian was through doing my 3 years in the provinces, and then you thought, well, I'm now ready to try a national paper. Of course, mostly that's gone now. Those routes don't exist, and broadly, I think that's for the good. I mean, there were advantages in doing that kind of training, but if you're going to have a more diverse paper, and I think Kath's done brilliantly on this, and in all respects, in sort of class, gender, ethnicity, mindset, regionality. I mean, there are so many ways in which you have to reflect the readership that you're writing about. And I think it's been one of the hugely positive things of recent times, that idea that there was a set way into The Guardian, or there was a set type of Guardian person, has changed out of all recognition.
Katharine, that's been quite important for you, hasn't it, to try and change that?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's even worse than Alan described it, though, because it seemed to me when I read the histories of The Guardian that it just seemed to be people's relatives, their cousins, their sons, their brother. I mean, it was just a kind of real family business for a very long time, So, but yeah, I mean, I think it's so important that we diversify. We've made great strides, but I feel there's a long way to go, because I got quite obsessed. Actually, it was around the Grenfell Tower fire. I thought, who decides what is the news? And if everyone who decides what makes news comes from the same background, as culturally, socially, in terms of race and gender, then they're going to make the same decisions about what news is, and that's fine. It's just going to be incredibly narrow. Whereas if you get people from all different walks of life, you've got a much richer offering, and you're going to get just loads more interesting stories. So I'm really committed to that. So one way of doing that is trying to advertise as many jobs as possible. We've got the fantastic Scott Trust bursary, which is going for a long time, which gives bursaries to people who come from ordinary backgrounds and want to do the training at some good courses around the country. And that's been a really great way of finding, exciting, diverse young journalists. But I think, it's a real work in progress, but it's so important. I think it's going to be one of the big themes in journalism in the next 5 or 10 years.
Great, thank you. I've got a few more questions here. I don't know if I'll fit any more in, but if anyone else does have one, we've not got long left, so throw them in now. This is really interesting, and I know something that's been a big focus of the 200-year anniversary. So maybe, Katharine, you can start on this. As The Guardian continues on a global front, what is The Guardian's approach to engaging a younger audience whose attention is far less, well, you may not agree with this, but whose attention is far less loyal and a lot shorter?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like for as long as I've been at The Guardian, I joined in 1997, we've always been worrying about young readers, and yet we've always had more young readers than everybody else. So, we're obviously doing something right. I think there's, in America, for example, we have more millennials not so young anymore, but we have more millennial readers than all the millennial focused websites do, so it's, I think it's partly because we have such a great digital offering, and I think it's partly because we focus on the subjects that young people really care about, such as the environment and gender and race and so on. And they can, we've got quite a lot of young people on staff and people that young readers can relate to. So I'll never be complacent about that, but we do have a really sizable and committed younger audience, I'm delighted to say.
This is a good question for both of you. As many of the patrons will know, although obviously things are different during COVID, The Guardian holds an open morning conference and often has guests at it. Although I seem to remember that it was during the last Labour leadership election that all the restrictions came in. And so I think we were expecting to have Keir Starmer, and then alas, that was perhaps the first one that was cancelled as the new world came in. But the question is, who have been your favourite morning conference guests? Alan, do you want to start?
Well, the most embarrassing one was, what's her name, Kath? Kurt Cobain's girlfriend.
Oh, Courtney Love.
Courtney Love. So there was, we would have archbishops and we would have bishops and directors of the Bank of England and very, very sensible, serious people. And somebody asked Courtney Love in. And she quickly got the dynamic of the meeting that everyone would feel embarrassed on my behalf if she could embarrass me. And she sat next door to me and then sort of got closer and closer to me until she practically had her tongue in my ear, and I was sort of edging more and more away from her. And she could tell that this was causing huge amusement to the whole staff, that they would talk about this for centuries afterwards. And it completely succeeded. I was sort of a little puddle of embarrassment by the end of the conference. And she had made a complete idiot of me. So that is, I think, the conference that stands primarily in my mind.
I think that's sexual harassment in the workplace, Alan. I think you've got a case.
I think it was, yeah. It would, she couldn't get away with it now.
Definitely not. So, do you not remember the Dominic Cummings visit, Alan? That was pretty. Well,
there are so many.
Told us all to think. I mean, it is interesting actually because I've really missed morning conference. We do it. What we do now, we do it like this. We do it online, and we have hundreds of people attending. The foreign correspondents love it because they can all dial in. You know, the Australian team love it because, you know, sometimes they can join in. You know, we get the Americans to get up early sometimes. So there are some advantages, but it doesn't have that obviously visceral in-person element. And I remember just after I started in 2015, and there was that Labour leadership election, and we had all the candidates in one week after another. And I remember when it was pretty obvious that something was happening when they all got, you know, decent crowds. And then for Corbyn, there were just hundreds of people dying to get in. All of the technologists, all the engineers had come down in their Corbyn t-shirts, and it was just like, wow, something really big is happening here. And I think it's almost like conference gave us that indication. I also love it, you know, when we have foreign journalists coming in to talk about their lives and their challenges, and I think the staff always really enjoy that as well, because you know, it makes us feel sort of grateful to have some, you know, freedoms.
Absolutely. So I think we've probably only got time for one more, and I think this is quite a good one. So let me put it to you. What I've always loved about The Guardian is that you trust your readers. So the opinion pages sometimes contain commissioned pieces that may not necessarily posit or reflect my own left of centre view. Is plurality in opinion something you've consciously pursued? Can you comment on this? Alan, and then Katharine.
I think it's terribly important. Tina Brown, who used to edit the New Yorker, had this brilliant phrase of biting the hand that reads you. You know, it's a very boring paper if you agree with everything in it. And Kath mentioned Georgina Henry, who was my deputy and who set up, you know, comment is free, and that the clue was in the name. And suddenly you went from a world in which, as it were, Thomas Friedman, the great New York Times correspondent, would write about India, and he would write about the Middle East and Russia and China and Australia and Venezuela, because they had one person who wrote about the world. And suddenly we unleashed dozens and then hundreds of different voices, and it was scary, and it was cacophonous. Sometimes it was chaotic, but it gave you a different idea of what a news organization could be and how diverse and challenging a news organization could be, rather than just simply holding up a mirror to your own opinions.
Katharine?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so important to The Guardian. Scott himself said, you know, the voices of opponents no less than of friends have a right to be heard, which is a line I quote quite often to people, because I think, you know, there is often an instinct to, you know, sort of say, you know, for some people to sort of say, let's retreat to the comfort zone and so on. And I think that's getting more and more the case. I think, you know, I think pluralism feels less and less fashionable. But as a result, I think it's more and more important that we embrace it. So, I mean, obviously, you know, you wouldn't have, you know, actual sort of, you know, fascism or whatever. You know, there are absolutely limits to what we would run. But I do think a breadth of opinion. I mean, I don't know about you, but I work out what I think more from reading a piece that I disagree with than one that I agree with, and that helps me sort of hone my arguments. And I think, you know, you're not serving readers if you don't give them that,
especially as their echo chambers become louder and louder on social media. That was brilliant, and we've come to the end of our time, so I'm going to thank Katharine and Alan, and also thank our audience, and just let you know that there are 2 more exclusive patrons events coming up in this Guardian at 200 series. How Journalism Changed Us, taking a look back at some of the Guardian's most prominent investigations, and Light Relief with the Guardian's best loved columnists. Additionally, Guardian Live is hosting a digital festival in June with guests like Gordon Brown, Naomi Klein and Akra Khan. For more information on all of these events and to book your place, go to patrons.theguardian.com. Thank you all very, very much for watching and for supporting The Guardian and for all your questions tonight. And most of all, a huge thanks to Katharine and Alan for joining us tonight. Good night and enjoy the rest of your evening.